So welcome, members. So this is being recorded today. Obviously, we're not televised, but it will be. The recording will be available on the Northern Ireland Assembly website afterwards. So we just welcome anybody who will be coming into the public gallery, and just to ensure your phones are muted. I have received apologies from Timothy and Carol. Anyone else aware of any? No? Okay. And declarations of interest, any to declare? No? Okay, thank you. So, no real chairperson's business today, but I just want to put on record my thanks to the clerk and his staff for organising this, and for the team within the Executive Office. It was some feat to pull all this together and get the staff up from Belfast, so I really, really appreciate that, and looking forward to this session today in particular. So members, the draft minutes are in your pack, pages 3 to 9 of the table pack, and just want to check he's all content that they're a true record. Okay, if you're content that I'll go ahead and sign them. Okay, thank you. So members, in terms of matters arising, on page 15 of the pack you'll find the clerk's brief on the committee motion on a review of racist incidents. You'll recall last week we put it to members around the potential for a committee motion to call on the First and Deputy First Minister to carry out, to commission a comprehensive review into the racist attacks in July and August of this year, and to include, for example, what happened, why it happened, who was involved, and to bring forward any proposals on how to prevent it happening again. Are members content with how the motion is amended, or would they drafted, or would they like to amend it? No? Okay. Okay, so I think we'll go ahead and engage with the Business Office then around that. Okay, so thank you again for your work on that. Also, you'll draw your attention to page 17 of the pack, and it's the letter from Queen's University Belfast to advise that Professor Smith has written to say that one of his answers last week was incorrect. Professor Smith stated at the committee meeting that all bodies received from the Belfast Union Workhouse were adults, and Professor Smith would like to clarify that of the 50 children's bodies received, 20 came from the Belfast Union Workhouse. All of these were received during the period of 1933 to 1946. 13 were known to be buried, and for the remaining 7 children's bodies, there is no record, and Queen's would like to apologise for this error. Excuse me. Thank you. So that's all that business. So we're going to move on to our oral briefing today.
Sorry, Chair.
Sorry, go ahead.
Just under matters arising.
Yes.
Just could refer, let me just find the page number, but just with the request for the First Minister to be recalled.
Oh, yes. Okay, that's a good point. Yes.
We were to request legal advice on the
Yes.
matter. Have we received legal advice back, or?
Not yet, no. It's been commissioned. It could take up to the 22nd of October, but I'm working with legal services to see if we can get it earlier.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. That was a good point. I thought about that earlier in the car to ask about. So, yes, thank you, members. We'll move on to our oral briefing from the Strategic Investment Board, and I'll refer members to page 23 for the clerk's brief. And so I'm going to welcome to the meeting Scott Wilson, Head of Regeneration and Interim Head of Investment Strategy at the Strategic Investment Board, Joan O'Hara, Director of Urban Villages and Infrastructure at the Executive Office, and Johneen, is that pronounced properly? Yes, Johneen Wright, Acting Head of Strategic Investment and Regeneration at the Executive Office. So welcome to our meeting today. Really appreciate you getting the briefing papers through to us. So if you'd just like to make some opening remarks, thank you.
Sure. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm Scott Wilson, as was said there, from SIB. I've been leading on the development of the investment strategy for 2.5 years now. Prior to that, I was just Head of Regeneration, so I'm both at the moment. But I've been with it in SIB on and off since around about 2008.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that was my intro.
Oh, that was good. Do you just want to talk about your roles?
Can I just check, has everybody got a copy of the presentation? Because I have hard copies available. Should anybody need a hard copy?
Can I have a hard copy?
Yep.
Computer's
I'm
not
just
really
pass
working.
them around. Sorry, because Scott's going to run through presentation.
Okay.
So, Chair, if you're content, I'll walk through the presentation.
Yes, yeah.
Each page in a little bit of detail, and then open it up for questions.
Thank you.
I'll just wait till it gets around the room.
Lovely. Thank you so much.
Okay. So it's just a short presentation, really, to give you an idea of the structure of the document as to where it is at the moment. The introduction just gives you a little bit of a timeline of the development of the document. The last investment strategy we had was actually in 2011, which I think is the same time as the last PFG we had, so they tend to run in tandem. A draft was approved by the executive in December 2021 for consultation. That primarily dealt with the vision and objectives, didn't get into any detail around numbers or investment. And we ran a consultation process up until April of that year, and then worked on finalising. But we did a lot of engagement at the time. We probably engaged with over 400 individuals and organisations through the process, and that's before we produced the draft and throughout the consultation and since as well. We've done a lot of engagement since. And then we produced a report which is on our website, so you can see it on SIB's website, the consultation report. Broadly supportive, but we got quite a lot of information about how we might change the document, which is what I'm going to present to you today. Once we'd done that, we then started engaging with the department, because whilst the strategy does look out to 2050, there's an element of it that looks at what are we going to do in the next 10 years. So we engage with the departments to ask them what projects and programmes are you likely to invest in over the next 10 years, and we got quite a lot of information back. We then, once we got through that, one thing which I'm happy to cover in more detail is that we wanted to create some kind of lens on the projects from a policy perspective and a priority perspective. So one of the things we developed was a qualitative assessment criteria. So we looked at all the different policies across government, and there's a score of 1 to 10, and we road tested this with a few projects during that period of time, where you almost measure qualitatively how does a particular project align with regional balance or align with climate change, etc., etc. We've got some good data there, and when the final investment plan is approved, we could rerun that again and see where we're at in terms of what is approved by the executive. We then, at that point, we were engaging closely with the PFG team, so sort of co-developed the documents to look and feel quite similar to each other. We also had a period of engagement with the political parties, the party leader briefing process that the head of the Civil Service commissioned. We produced the draft in January of this year, and the executive was reformed in February, so we went back and had another look at where things need to change. So, for example, the Minister for the Economy came out with the economic vision, which is slightly different to 10X, so we made some adjustments to the document to take account of that. And we have completed a final document, which is with the First Minister and Deputy First Minister at the moment for consideration. Separate to that is a separate piece of work we're doing with the departments on the investment plan. So what is it that we're going to actually, which projects are we going to prioritise over the next 10 years? So the first section of the document is the vision and objectives. So that's the part that looks out to 2050. As you'll see, the language is very similar to Programme for Government, People, Planet, Prosperity. We've got a resilient public services wrapper around the top of that. And under each of those objectives, there is a series of priorities, and the way the document's set out, there's maybe 5 or 6. That's just a summary on the slide there. Under each of those, where it sets out where are we now, what do we need to do, and where do we want to be by 2050. So it sort of explains a journey that we want to go on out to 2050. The next section of the investment plan, and there's 2 parts to this. So there's the first part, which is how much funding are we likely to get over the next 10 years. So obviously, it's 90% of it's guesswork, because there's only 1 year certain, but it's a pretty well-researched guess. So we've done a lot of work with the Fiscal Council, the Department of Finance, and we've come up with a number of 26 billion over the next 10 years. And the pie chart there splits it. Obviously, most of it is the capital that we get from Treasury, the CDEL, as it's called. And there's other elements of it, which is borrowing, which was adjusted back in February because there was additional borrowing allowed through the deal from the British government. There's shared island allocation in there, and there's lots of little bits like capital receipts and local authority contributions. which comes up to 26 billion. One thing, the capital element is only 80% of what we predict the full capital to be from Treasury, and there's a couple of reasons for that. This investment plan is trying to raise the bar on strategic projects and not do everything. So we sort of set a lower limit that, one, we're only interested in looking at things that actually are infrastructure, so not capital grants to farmers or capital grants to businesses. And we set a limit of 20 million as well, just a reasonably arbitrary, but there's sort of a view that a major strategic project is somewhere around 20 to 25 million, so we set it at 20 million just to set a bar. But also as well, we did a bit of analysis of the previous 10 years and how real inflation in construction didn't follow the inflationary element of the money we got from Treasury. So there is an element of the 20% we've set aside for what you might call superinflation, if that ever arises. So it's not all of the capital that's been allocated. So the next slide then is the demand side of that. So when I said we went out to departments seeking what they are likely to want to do over the next 10 years, the answer was 44 billion pounds worth of projects and programmes over the next 10 years. So obviously it far exceeds the envelope that we're likely to get. But interestingly, when you break down that 44 billion, there is over 8 billion of what you might call committed or underway projects, things like flagships, city deals, city and growth deals. The growth deals are in there as well. And some of the projects that are underway and nearly finished, for example, like the Belfast Transport Hub, which is nearly finished, but there's a bit of expenditure left on it. We asked departments to focus on the backlog maintenance of their estate as well, because we all know the issues with the likes of housing, but there's also water, there's the justice estate, there's health and education as well. And we got some really good data back from the departments about what those problems are, because we felt that we cannot ignore this now. From a climate perspective, if we let this fall over, it's going to be awfully expensive from a carbon point of view to replace these. And that was 10 billion of need. And then the rest is all either new things or things we're familiar with, like the Social Housing Development Programme or Health Investment Programme. So sort of to conclude the point there, the 26 billion in itself, if you do the inflation adjustment, is 25% bigger than we did in the last decade. So it is significantly bigger. However, there's 18 billion of investment that is just not going to be covered within that 26 billion pound envelope. And I think as well the scale of what we have as commitments, like flagships, and the scale of the maintenance demand means that there's much less money for what you might call new projects. But the point on new projects is now with the Climate Change Act, we have to work to new rules now on how we develop these projects and programmes. The last section, I don't know if anyone listened to the Public Accounts Committee a couple of weeks ago, but there was quite a lot of detail given around what we call the Enabling Action Plan. So this came through the consultation process where it's all well and good as talking about spending 26 billion, but there is an awful lot of things that happen to stop us doing that. Things like planning, like the business case process, like not getting social licence from communities before you start doing projects, etc. So we developed a concept, and then what we did in the early part of the year, we went back to 2013 and looked at all the legacy audit office reports, CVI reports, OECD reports, of which there were 105 recommendations around things that need to change for major capital projects. So what we did is we mapped them to the Enabling Action Plan, and the next page you'll see we came up with 12 actions. One recent piece of work that SIB actually did was the root cause analysis. So it gets right under this, not what happens, but why does it happen? And that's on our website as well, which is quite a short report, but it's a very interesting read around where things go wrong and why. But we use that report to split the Enabling Action Plan into people, process and policy. So these are the 12 actions that we have in the but we're actually working on through the NICS board at the moment, trying to mobilise these, get moving on some of the work around this. And I'm very happy to, if anyone has any questions individually on them, I'm very happy to give some feedback. The final is the delivery and assurance. So how we're going to make sure that happens. So the image just tries to succinctly on one page show the executive at the top. NICS board does the accounting officer monitoring. We've set up a subcommittee of the NICS board. It's one of 3 subcommittees that are going to be set up for the NICS board, and it's called the ISNI committee. It's chaired by Patrick McGee, who's one of the non-exec members of the NICS board. And we're probably up to our 3rd or 4th meeting now through that committee, getting these enabling actions mobilised. And it's going very well. And then finally, obviously, the delivery responsibility lies with departments. So where we're at the moment is, as I said earlier, the draft is with the First Minister and Deputy First Minister. They're considering it at the moment. Once they've considered it, it will go to the Executive, and then the next step would be to go in front of the Assembly.
Okay, thank you.
Not at all.
Any contributions from your colleagues?
No.
No? Okay. Well, thank you very much. I had put down there around the planning process, and I see then you were talking about the enabling, and then you used the word, the enabling action plan, and you used the word mobilise, because I suppose as elected representatives we're very conscious of how slow you'll be consulted, or pre-planning consultation on a scheme, and then it'll be about 2 years later and you'll be like, oh, I forgot about that. Yeah. So how willing do you think that the broader civil service is to actually bring about the changes that are needed to drive or enable this investment strategy to be delivered? Thank you.
So the way these are positioned, there's 2 actions relating to planning actually on that slide. 4 and 5. These are in flux at the moment. So they're essentially led by the Department for Infrastructure, because they have the responsibility for planning.
Yes.
They have an established planning improvement programme already, which is up and running. So the idea would be that the first action would acknowledge that, as and that's been set. Its scope has been set. But our view is that the fixes for planning are long beyond the tenure of the current minister. They're going to take years to fix. There's an awful lot of things to do. So what we're trying to position the second item is on the more longer term. So they're the wrong way around at the moment, but they need to be. We're in the process with DFI of getting those properly described and scoped.
Okay.
But essentially, we're going to respect the fact DFI have a planning improvement programme, and then look further into the future about what further changes might be necessary. And
is it a similar process going on in procurement as well? So it can be a big beast as well.
Yeah, so procurement is, so we have a project set up with all the centres of procurement expertise, nominally led by CPD as the one in the centre, if you like. The idea there is that the ISNI will have a financing plan, and it'll have an enabling action plan. It needs a procurement plan as well. So the deliverable for that group is, how are you going to work together, and how are you going to do things consistently together to deliver, to set out a procurement plan on how 26 billion of infrastructure might be procured. So there's the internal bit of that, which is how they're going to organise themselves, but there's also the external bit, is, can the market cope? Has the market got capacity to deliver this amount of work? So that's what we'd expect to see in the plan, and that has terms of reference agreed, and that one's mobilised and up and running, led by Sharon Smith in CPD.
Good to hear. Last one for me, a small one. And I'm almost conscious of our fabulous surroundings here today in Ebrington, and I'm just wondering to what degree the transfer of surplus land from government departments into this scheme, is that factor in terms of the strategy around?
Not so much, really.
No?
We don't really get down to that level of detail, to be honest. I mean, there are, from an asset management perspective, there are rules and guidance owned by LPS on how you do that. So we're not really got down to the level of
identifying sites and
slots need to be. That almost happens down at project level.
Okay.
This is taking more of a sort of helicopter view of what all the projects are going to do.
Okay, the policy framework. Thank you. I'll maybe come back in a few more, but Connie, please.
Yeah, thank you all for coming and meeting with us today. I think just if you to pick up on a few things you'd maybe mentioned, just for some more information. You'd mentioned about 18 billion of investment demand cannot be met within the assumed funding envelope. Could you talk a bit more about that, and what kind of projects then we're likely to see won't get the go-ahead?
Yeah, well, I can't talk about that because the investment plan that sits underneath that is currently being considered by departments, so I don't have the information. We've put a feel like a scenario out for departments to comment, and they're still looking at that scenario. But most of it, I mean, the way I described there, we've got an awful lot of commitments, political commitments and projects underway. We've got an awful lot of maintenance to deal with. So most of the pressure lands on new things or things that aren't political commitments, if you see what I mean. So, but we have some very big portfolios of investment, like water, like public transport, like housing. You know, and obviously it'll be for the executive and the ministers to decide where they want to put their priorities. But because they're so big, you know, I don't think anybody's going to get all the money they're looking for. But because they're so big, they may proportionally look worse, if you see what I mean. So I don't have at the moment I can't give you any project by project details because we've not got the feedback from departments yet.
Okay. No, thank you. What kind of, when you talk about the big sort of projects, I think just to talk more about what Paula said about, we're finding, I'm finding especially in my constituency, NI Water is one of the key hold-ups to large planning applications. Yeah. Is that something that is taken into consideration, obviously, and need to invest in those to kind of move forward as well? Yeah, so Enabling Action 9,
what that is it's looking to address this problem of underfunding. We'll have to look for either alternative governance or alternative financing to fill the gap in some of these things. So nothing specific at the moment. I mean, the one is there seems to be a reasonable will from the perspective of Department for Communities for the Housing Executive. So the reconstitution of the Housing Executive would be one where you would see their maintenance liability not having to be funded from public funds. So you could free up the public funding you would have spent in housing into other infrastructure. But at the moment, there's nothing on the table with respect to water, other than Enabling Action 9 gives us the hook to look at that if the executive chose to.
Thanks. Sinead, please. Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation. I suppose I want to concentrate probably first instance about regional balance. And you indicated that you've done an analysis of previous investments. So what is the breakdown of spend and investment for each of the council area in the previous strategy, in the previous...
I haven't done that analysis. What we did was a qualitative assessment framework. So any new projects or proposed projects would be looked through a lens of people, planet, prosperity. And sorry, I know there's no video today, but that's a copy of it there, which I can circulate to the committee. Where we will look at, so one of the categories under prosperity is regional balance. So we'll look at a project across 15 different categories across the 3 objectives. And you get a measure of, so we set this up, we engaged with the Irish government who'd done this for climate and environment, and we've expanded it out to look at social and economic as well. So it's in its early stages of road testing, but I haven't, just to answer your question, I haven't done the analysis of spend from the previous 10 years.
No.
By
right, okay, yeah. So, and obviously, it's really important that analysis is done, because it's very clear that significant investment has gone into the BMA area of Northern Ireland, and the regions have been significantly left behind. So we need to understand the value of the spend within your remit, within the Strategic Investment Board that has gone into various parts of Northern Ireland and the impact that has in regional balance. And I suppose if we look at the programme for government and we look at the Minister for the Economy, I mean, there is a very clear setting or resetting that we must have regional balance, and if you look at the approach to date, it has gone terribly wrong. So in order to set a new strategy going forward, you've got to analyse what has taken place in the past. And I think if we did an analysis of council by council basis, or even constituency by constituency basis, of where the money, the high level money for major projects has been spent, we would get a very clear picture of what imbalance looks like. So I think that's really, really important. And I suppose that leads me to, to ask you in this draft investment strategy, how have you factored in regional balance?
In the qualitative assessment.
In the qualitative assessment, and how are you measuring it? Are you measuring
qualitatively? So, but we can't. We could when the investment plan is set, you could then do an analysis. Where I don't think it would work. So, is Casement Park a Belfast project or a region-wide project? The A5 benefits both ends of the A5 and probably wider as well. So just
look at some of the big projects that you've had to date. So the regional or the Belfast Transport Hub, the university new campus, for example. They're all centralised, I would say, maybe in a 2-mile radius in the greater Belfast area or the centre of Belfast area. So these are major transformative initiatives. Even if you look at investment in the hospitals and things like that. This is Northern Ireland's investment strategy. But are we investing in Northern Ireland or are we investing in Belfast?
Okay, yeah.
And that I mean, it's really important to do the back look. I know we're looking at strategy going forward and the draft investment strategy. I want to look back to see how we can improve and what we did wrong in a regional basis and how places like this have been left behind.
Yeah, okay.
Can you supply that then? Any other questions?
Okay.
Sorry, can I just add? We could do the past, but the forward look would have to wait for the investment plan to be settled. So maybe we do when that's settled, we do the two at the same time. Yeah.
But it would be very concerning to me that if the Executive Office and the First Minister and Deputy First Minister are about to sign off a strategy that hasn't really analysed the past in terms of where investments were made in such a strategic level. So I want to ask you about the McGee Task Force. There was a significant amount of work done in the report there recently, and some of that was it indicated that it would work with the Strategic Investment Board in order to coordinate some of the infrastructure pieces that were required in order to grow and develop McGee University or at the university in Derry here. Are you working with that task force, and how are you doing that to overcome some of the major infrastructure pieces and for example like student accommodation and things like that? Is that figured into?
Yeah, so the project itself will probably be in the strategy because it's a commitment. So that's the first thing. The second thing, we have had one of our people working with the task force over the summer who was doing that in between projects. So his other project he has to move to, but I was actually having a conversation about this morning, so we're going to engage with DFE on the basis of how can SIB continue to help the department and the university on that. So that is a live conversation about getting involved in that.
And I'm going to ask another about water infrastructure. Obviously, water infrastructure is a major issue throughout. It doesn't matter what constituency you come from, but there's a particular issue in Derry that is stymieing investment and private sector investment as well. So how does that feature in the plan and trying to overcome some of those major barriers?
Yeah, so the plan currently deals with the amount of public money that's going in, and there's only a finite amount of the public money. As I mentioned earlier, there's an enabling action around how can we look at other ways of doing it. So no work done yet on that, but there's a place marker there to be able to press ahead with doing something in that area. But I don't see 26 billion getting bigger over the next 10 years. There'll be another budget. We're going to review this every year because every time there's a budget, these numbers will change because the long-term predictions will change as well. But I can't see this filling in our 18 billion gap, frankly. It's very unlikely over the next 10 years, so we have to look to other sources, and that's why we have that enabling action to do that. But it's DFI's responsibility, water, and we will certainly help them, but it's their responsibility. So that's how we've positioned it in here, that there is there's work to do, but it would be led by DFI because they're the sponsor of water.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Sinead, Claire, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you. I suppose it's to kind of pick up on the point around planning. You had mentioned the Climate Change Act and our statutory responsibilities in relation to that.
Yeah.
And this is, a major strategic approach insofar as it's going to be long term in a lot of things. However, what can we do in the short term to kind of address other problems? And I suppose the reason I mentioned planning and climate change, I have a constituent who's very significant private sector investment in my constituency, which requires planning. Mm-hmm. And in an 88-page statutory consultee response, not one mention of the Climate Change Act.
Right.
And from their perspective and the type of business that they're investing in, the Climate Change Act could provide opportunities because of the incentives that will be required for more of that type of investment. So I suppose if statutory consultees after the Act is in place as part of the planning process are not even considering that, how do we look at this more long term? How do we do that now, but how do we ensure that's more long term? Because I do think there will be opportunities with the Climate Change Act. Another point that you talked about, and I'd be keen to hear more about this, is the kind of upstream approach, so the reasons maybe why, the issues, and how we're looking at that, because I suppose it's kind of to take on Sinead's point as well, in that if we don't forward work plan, the things that you build will be out of date, and the committee will not be surprised to hear that we're an ageing population. How are we taking that into account? That we're building what we need to facilitate our ageing population, our medical buildings, all those types of things. So how are we considering our people and our demographics? Because sometimes I think we nearly look at it too obviously. I think we have to look at it in what we will need in 10 years from now.
Yeah. I'll cover your last point first.
Yeah, sure.
We actually started some work on population projections. One of the actions we've got in here is that to build up for the next investment strategy, which will be, let's say, in 3 years' time, with an awful lot more work to do on a needs assessment rather than a want assessment, if you understand what I mean. Yeah. And you start with the population assessment, and we put that out, and there's various schools of thought about where this is going to go, but ultimately the only growth you can see is through immigration. So we need to have a conversation about immigration, really, because we've all got to get on the same page about what population growth is, because the only growth, it depends on how much immigration you want, whether it's one, none, or lots. That's the only growth. Completely different to the rest of the UK and completely different to the Republic of Ireland. So we do need a proper debate about that, I think.
But beyond even the growth, the people who are living longer,
yes,
and what that means for employment.
Who's going to look after them?
Who's going to look after them? But equally, there's a ratio that means that people who are working are going to be doing that to support people who are not working, who are older. So, to me, there's a lot of considerations that we need to take into account. And to me, we don't do any sort of strategy without looking at who our people are.
Correct.
And is that currently in this policy, or is it? Are we?
So
are
we've got a sort of high-level view of where it's going. We need a deeper dive on it.
Okay.
My point being, I think we've started the ball rolling, but others like NISRA need to get involved.
Yeah.
What do they think?
And would it help if the programme for government had mentioned our demographics and older people?
Possibly.
Okay.
Yeah. But there's other, as far as infrastructure is concerned, the assessment we did, which is by no means correct, we got the Ulster University Economic Policy Centre to help us with it, but the school-age population is going down hugely.
That's right.
So by the time we get to the next investment strategy, we really need to take on board, is it because the schools aren't in the right place? Why, what is the plan for building schools? So that's a debate we really need to have, I think.
There's one more
No,
point
of course,
on that.
yeah, we've only one panel today, so yes.
And sorry, on your planning point, look, I'm not really in a position to advise on the whys and wherefores of climate change in planning policies. What we are doing in here, though, is what we don't have is we don't have quantification of carbon in our infrastructure. There's only one project that's done this, and that's the A5.
Okay.
We're doing work, and that's Enabling Action 12, by the way, on the list. We're starting some work with DFI to look at how did they do that, because the document's it's very thick. is there an easier way of doing this that we can roll out to other departments? But we've got to get to a point where we see, and this is written into the current draft of the document, where you start with a project at the concept stage, and you want to see the carbon curve going down all the way to get into final business case stage. So how do you do that? What's the guidance around doing that? And DFI are the first and only project I'm aware of in Northern Ireland that has actually taken that on. So that's something we've got to get across, because we can't just say all new projects beyond commitments and maintenance have to abide by the Climate Change Act without producing some guidance on how you do it.
Yeah, and equally mitigations. So it's not just about what you take away; it's about what you add in that will create that net, effect. And that's where investment, comes into its own. I suppose the other point you kind of reminded me of is we also need to look at, I suppose, investment in terms of, like I represent the North Coast. And one of the biggest issues in the North Coast is second homes, insofar as that people are coming there at the weekends. They're not necessarily using services like schools and hospitals because they're getting that midweek wherever else they live in Northern Ireland. That's leading to schools potentially lowering their numbers. I know it's to do with birth rate as well, but eventually those services are going to die away because there's not people using them on a full-time basis. Have you looked at Northern Ireland, not just on the North Coast, but it's happening in Bangor and other nice areas that people like to retire to or like to spend their weekends, to ensure that we're not going to end up with a situation where we've lost all of our services? Because eventually then the second homeowners will move out because the services don't exist for them when they need them. So I suppose it's trying to look at all the very specific issues that we're starting to see now, because I do see the impact not tomorrow but in 10, 20 years, which is what I see this as an opportunity to address.
So a lot of this is or a lot of the information is bottom up. So our health thinking about that, our education thinking about that comes up through the projects, we'd hope. But the infrastructure needs assessment for the next Disney will take a more data-led approach to what we need.
Okay. And, I'd say that every MLA in the Assembly and around this table will have experience and information on that local level to advise that process. Okay. And I don't know if that has already been engaged in this particular plan. But it's what we see in here on a daily basis. So,
Can I just pick up on that point, bring Harry in? So this is under consideration by the First and Deputy First Minister at the minute. Have you been given an indication of when they're going to sign off, and will it then go out to consultation so that there could be a wider discussion about its content?
So the consultation's been done.
Oh right, so it has been. So they're not going to go back out again.
So it'll go back out probably to the Assembly, I imagine. After it goes to the
so that's really the point around a final.
And I haven't had an indication exactly when it's going to be approved. But I did meet at the end of August just to give an update then. So I don't have an answer for when it's actually going to be approved by the First and Deputy First Minister.
Okay, Harry, please. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. You had mentioned in your investment plan, investment demand and new projects, 44 billion over the next 10 years. You said some of these are already underway. I just wonder how many are underway, or can you tell us that?
I don't know. I can get you the number. I can't remember, but it's committed and
probably under the committed.
Yeah, committed and underway is in the. I can get the exact figure. It's in the order of about 60 or 70 projects that are underway.
I'd just be interested to see what.
Yeah, I can follow up with that.
That's okay. Thank you, Chair.
So, have you had any dealings with the City Deal conversations around the pausing and stuff? Is that, or is that?
No, not in-depth ones. No. What we have taken is, as far as this strategy is concerned, they remain intact because they're committed as far as we're concerned. Just because they're. I mean, it was that Friday that quite a lot of things were were off. But I may be wrong, but I understand there's a local commitment to stick to the amount of money that was going to go into the growth deals. I don't believe the city deals are a problem. It's the growth deals now.
Oh, sorry, the growth deals, yes.
So we'll just wait and see. But they remain there because they're committed projects.
Okay, thank you, Brian.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Just want to clarify one point that, first of all, that you said the reconstitution of the housing executive could result. How did you finish that sentence? In maintenance no longer being funded from capital, or how did you finish that?
So I did a bit of work with the the previous minister in DFC on this, helping the department on that. But and I don't have the exact numbers now, but there's an enormous backlog problem in the housing exec's stock. And the feeling was there's probably not going to be enough public money to solve that. And we were asked to look at, or the department was asked to look at alternative structures on how you could address that. And a proposition was come together, and this is in the programme for government as well, that there's a commitment to solve this, but it looks at accessing public borrowing. So it's not privatising it. It's so if you looked at the housing exec, if it was in England, it would be a local housing council, and they can borrow from the Public Works Loan Board. So why not the housing executive? Was the exam question there? And there were discussions. I understand, I'm not involved in them, but there were discussions with the Conservative government up until the election, and I'm not aware that the discussions have picked up since. But I think they may be wrapped up in the fiscal framework conversations at the moment.
Okay.
But that's what I mean by that. And the idea would be that if there was making a number of 100 million requirement of capital, public capital in 1 year for maintenance, as long as the rent could pay back the debt, you would go and get Public Works Loan Board debt to replace that. So what you do, you could switch out what you would have done with public money into something else. That's the theory.
Yeah.
Right. Well, because I thought you were going to finish the sentence by saying by borrowing against its assets to increase new build, but it's something similar. What you're saying?
That would be an extension of that. Yeah. So if they then wanted to, as long as the repayment capacity is there, they could borrow to build as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, again, that feeds into a wider question, because when I was on Belfast City Council, the council model developed more into for big significant capital investments into more like a mortgage type arrangement rather than saving up the money to build a new leisure centre or whatever. Yeah. That the council effectively would take out a loan, and then the ratepayers who are benefiting from the asset are paying that off over whatever 20, 25 years, and that would bringing more finance then into infrastructure investment or into capital investment. So is that a model? I mean, obviously you're talking about available finance primarily, but in order to address the 18 billion shortfall, are departments able to utilise that model of effectively taking out loans that they're paying off over time? So
it's quite limited. So if you go back to that chart, Investment Plan 1 funding supply, and you see borrowing 2.3, that is the RRI borrowing, the Reinvestment and Reform Initiative. So that is the sum total of the borrowing limit that the executive has, which was 200 million a year, and I think the recent British government deal brought it up to 230 million, or there or thereabouts, so it was increased slightly. But that is, and that needs to be repaid. So that's in a similar model to you described, where 2.3 billion though over 10 years. So that's 230 roughly per year, and that has to be repaid. So that's I think that's National Loan Fund. I think that comes from. So that would be, I don't know what it is, changes every day, but let's say 4.6% repayment on that. The executive has to pay that back with resource money, not capital money, which causes a problem because resource budget is a problem. So that would be the only equivalent. So back in the old days when you went and did PFIs and PPPs, that was a similar way. The problem is that the budgeting and accounting rules changed back in 2015 or 16, where all of that borrowing comes on the balance sheet. So there's no additionality to a department to do that anymore. So if it does a private finance project for 100 million, all it means is it's got 100 million of public money less to spend. So one takes away the other. So there's just no incentive to do that.
Well, speaking as a member of Board of Governors of a school built under PFI, I'm no fan of that model. Right. I'm not sure that. But I do see value if it can be borrowing, but as long as the ownership of the asset isn't lost to the public sector. And the last question, Chair.
Yes, fine.
I mean, the action plan there, enabling action plan. to my reading of it, it doesn't actually offer any channels for increasing the funding available, unless number 9, prepare options for alternative governance models to increase financial leverage. So can you explain that one more? And also, are you factoring in, or in this plan, private sector investment? I know we've just talked about PFI, but can the private sector, can there be models? Is that what that's referring to? Models where private sector investment could increase what funds are available? Yeah.
So the last point first, the 26 billion we're going to spend, some of that naturally leverages in private money anyway. So if you think for every £6 we spend on social housing, we get £4 of private money, and there's a bank debt goes into that as well. A lot of what the Department for Economy does has a £1 in, £2 out leverage factor as well. So our guess is that if and obviously it depends on the project as well, if there's an executive's decision to do less of something and more of something else, that might switch the private leverage bit, but it would be about another 4 billion on top of the 26 would be private money that just gets leveraged in anyway because of the way the projects are constructed, like social housing, for example. Enabling action number 9 is really a place marker. I don't see any executive agreement to do anything in that space right now. In terms of looking at alternative governance. And what I mean by alternative governance is current governance where the public sector controls the asset or controls the body means you can't borrow. We just can't borrow. So if you look at alternative governance where, so I use the housing executive example, it's treated more like a council and get Treasury to accept that. You've effectively, in a roundabout way, the governance has been changed and then you can access borrowing. That's not put there to privatise things at the moment. I just don't see an appetite for that. But there's also other ways. I mean, if you take the All Ireland Strategic Rail Review and the UK Connectivity Review and you put the two together, they don't really conflict with each other at all when it comes to Northern Ireland in terms of what rail needs to be in Northern Ireland. So this isn't privatising or anything, but it's a proper engagement with Dublin and London about Northern Ireland's part of the All Ireland Strategic Rail Review would be a good thing to do, because I know the Dublin government is already speaking to the likes of the EIB on funding their bit of the All Ireland Strategic Rail Review, so there's any reason why we wouldn't as well. Mm-hmm. But again, that's for that's for DFI, because that's their area of responsibility.
Okay.
Thank you. Chair. Emma, please, and I'll bring you back in, Sinead.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to you all for the presentation. I suppose I know, and it's DFI technically responsibility in terms of NI Water, but we've heard different members refer to the capacity issue there and the impact that it's having on future plans and the ability to build. I'm a representative of Mid-Ulster, which is a constituency with the highest proportion of engineering businesses of anywhere in the north and a heavy reliance on the construction industry. And I suppose historically very little investment from the likes of Invest or any government funding of any description. And that has led to a situation whereby people are self-sufficient and self-reliant, and we have an awful lot of heavy industry and manufacturing and construction, and an awful lot of people who are leaving the constituency every day but contributing to the economy. And I know that we're here in Ebrington. Hearn Brothers is a business in the place that I'm from, and are hugely successful across the north and farther afield than that. It's kind of a frustration now that because of a lack of capital and probably a lack of foresight, that we're now going to be in a situation whereby people are being hamstrung. Looking at the funding supply that you've outlined there, and I know that we were hopeful that with a change of British government in July past that we might have seen an increase. Are we realistically going to see those problems resolved with the current pot?
Probably not, to be honest. The only hope I have in the short term is that there was an announcement earlier in the week that the Chancellor is going to look at changing the fiscal rules And the statement that followed that said this might unlock, I can't remember the number, 57 billion or something, huge number of money of investment, of private sector investment into infrastructure. But I don't know how that's going to relate to here. I don't know whether, this is not public money. But a changing of the fiscal rules allows the British government to borrow more. That's what they're trying to do, because they're restricted by their own rules on the borrowing. So that may be a way forward, but I don't, I'm being honest, I don't think public money is going to solve it, because we've so many commitments and so much maintenance that there's very little left for day-to-day and new. And that's...
It's just frustrating then, because you see an added burden upon people and businesses that have been very industrious and built themselves up and have got to a place where we've had this conversation with local people who are building houses and I suppose in some ways plugging that gap in terms of the lack of social housing that we have, and particularly in the rural area that I represent. And then they have got an extra fee imposed upon them, which obviously then will be put upon the consumer. And ultimately you're talking about working families who are doing everything that they can in order to scrape together what they need to be able to buy a house in the first place, and it's bumped up even further. So it's I suppose it's not really for you, but just appreciate what you've outlined. But it is frustrating to see the realities of where the capacity is and how it's blocked effectively.
It's a moment in time where a lot of these commitments are flagships that we set off in 2015. That's 9 years ago. Quite a few of them still haven't happened. We're facing that problem now rather than back then.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sinead, do you want to come back in?
Yeah, and it's just exactly, I'm coming back in exactly where you left. We have a difficulty in Northern Ireland to deliver some of these flagship programmes. Delay. So what should be done differently to help us deliver those major programmes in a timely way that helps save money? And you did bring up Casement Park, and that's an example of poor delivery in a timely way, and we see where that has left us at the minute. So the question really is, what should we do differently to deliver major flagship programmes that we're not doing at the moment?
Yeah, so that is exactly what the Enabling Action Plan is designed to do. So we've gone back and looked at where have faults been reported by the Audit Office or by the CBI or by whoever, and consolidated them into 12 things that seem to go wrong all the time that we need to address, and that's what the actions are for. So if you take the first two around people, because actually you can fix all the processes if you haven't got the right people to operate the fixed processes. You come back to that's the core of the issue. But we're doing we've got a paper going to the next ISNI committee to look at this in sort of 4 work streams. The first is we did some analysis around delivery. And we think around about 75% of delivery is actually done by arm's length bodies, not done by departments. We seem to default to civil service, but actually when it comes to delivering infrastructure, most of it is in arm's length bodies. The biggest bit of the civil service is road service, so they are civil servants, but they are a large part of delivery there. So what we're looking at with the arm's length bodies is, so we've met with the likes of TransLink and NI Water to look at what do you do around workforce planning. So and TransLink appear on the face of it at the moment to be quite sophisticated in this, that they do have a system where they want to get signalling engineers, but they can't afford to pay the wages, so they know rightly they have to outsource it as and when they need it, and then let it go and then bring it back again. So they're actually quite good at doing that. NI Water is pretty good as well. And what we want to do is try and get all the others up to that bar. So get the Education Authority up to that bar, Health Trusts up to that bar, Housing Executive. And so that's from those respective delivering projects. The road service bit is more about policies. So they have there's certain barriers which we've worked with road service on, about things that hold them back to get the right workforce. Their workforce is, a big chunk of it is getting close to retirement. So if we don't solve something in the next 5 to 7 years of road service, we're going to lose a lot of expertise. So we've identified some of the barriers, and what we're going to do, we're going to engage with Nick's HR and try and understand which policies create these problems and can we amend these policies. And the third bit, it's not all about the people that deliver, but the departments have 100% responsibility for investment decision making, monitoring business cases, risk assessment. And that workforce needs to be right as well, because again, there's no point fixing the delivery end if the investment decision making bit isn't functioning properly.
Yeah.
So that's a third work stream we're looking at. And the fourth then is the private sector. So not to forget that they're actually the people with the hard hats who actually deliver all of this. We've started a bit of work looking at what kind of jobs would be required to deliver a £26 billion programme of infrastructure. Very arbitrary at the moment because the plan isn't finalised yet, but we did a bit of work with Ulster University. So we've got emerging some data around what we're going to need. The next step is to talk about what have we got and what's the difference between the two and what skills programmes might be required to plug that gap. That's just the people bit, but there's actions around the business case process. So if you think of a project, it's business case, it's planning and it's procurement. They're the big heavy duty bits that get delayed, and there's an action for each of those areas to try and address where things go wrong.
You know, and we've seen some of the issues with our city deals, and we have 2 city deals that are not quite there yet, hopefully, at the end of the October review. But a lot of that has been our fault as well, because we've taken so long at doing business cases. You know, it's up the road, down the road, up the road, down the road, and it goes on and on and on. And so the required sign-off has never gone to the UK government because we've been left in this process. So, I mean, I can see the absolute importance of that enabling action plan and policy. Everything goes into a judicial review here. If you say you're going to create a roundabout, there's about 3 judicial reviews before you ever get off the roundabout, so to speak. So, but can I ask now a question about the Executive Office and the relationship with the Council? Obviously, this is a very unique Ebrington. It's a very unique setting here and has a very unique relationship with central government. However, decision making about this place, you know, eventually needs to get closer to home, so it needs to get back to Derry City and Strabane Council. How far on are you with those conversations, and what's the direction of travel, and how can we support, as an executive office, how can we support the council? Because obviously there's a resource issue here as well. You know, it's not just about holding assets, it's about maintaining the assets and growing the assets and developing them. So there's quite a bit of money involved. So
yeah, well, we're really keen that Ebrington as an asset does go to the council, and we are working very closely with them to make that happen. There's due diligence that needs to take place in terms of finances, and conversations to take place with our colleagues in council to see what their expectations are and what ours are as well. So that is currently happening. But in terms of other things that have happened, the events process, council carry out the events process on behalf of the Executive Office. So that's one step. And another step closer to home is the maintenance for the site. And we're looking to council to, obviously with resource, but looking to council to take on the maintenance for Ebrington. So hopefully by the end of this financial year we'll have worked something out with them. So we're small steps with the aim of transferring the whole kit and caboodle. Maybe over the, I'm scared to say it here because be held to it, but I would like to say within 3 years it would go to council.
what do you regard as the biggest barriers?
Probably working out the due diligence and the finance, and working out, because I think during the tour we were actually talking about how Ebrington needs to wash its own face type of thing, you know, because we have service charges for all our tenants, which, depending on what the tenants need, we talked about car parking actually on the tour, and one of the issues is, obviously, as you're aware, is car parking, but in order to address that car parking, we may need to put more security on site, If we put more security on site, that's more cost to our tenants, to our service charges. So then it has to cover the costs. But what I've heard from council colleagues is they obviously don't want to have an impact on the ratepayer for Derry City and Strabane District Council. Mm-hmm. So we need to work that out, and that's the process that we're undertaking at the minute.
And how much?
Sorry, Claire's trying to get back in as well. No, go ahead, finish your question.
No, how much does that cost on an annual basis to the executive office?
To run the site?
Yeah.
I haven't got that figure in my head at the minute, but I can get it for you. I know for next year, I was looking at the figures today about our resource spend for next year, which is 1.5 million in resource money, but not all of that. Some of that's for the events and whatever as well that we're proposing to do on the site. So I will come back to the committee on that.
Okay. Thank you. Go ahead, Claire.
Thank you. Is there opportunity through private sector investment? Because you had said that it's not going to be paid entirely by public funding. So if there is interest in Northern Ireland, significant interest to the point that the costs of putting appropriate infrastructure in place, is there opportunities through that, and how do you work with them to try and identify that? Yeah. I suppose I'm trying to think of it even in terms of my own constituent. It's significant investment. They are going to change the infrastructure to enable their project. So that is obviously a cost to them that could benefit, Northern Ireland. So how do we identify those opportunities?
So what we've done in the recent past, there's a thing called the Northern Ireland Investment Fund, so we have a type of money which is on the chart there, FTC, Financial Transactions Capital, which is like a form of, it's been used as a form of debt in the past. That fund has actually been quite successful. This hotel actually was funded by Financial Transactions Capital through the Northern Ireland Investment Fund, managed by CBRE. And that concept, so you may have seen the Minister for Economy's announcement around the Net Zero Accelerator Fund. So that is a similar concept, but a different time. So debt's maybe not the problem, it's equity that's maybe the problem. This time you change the way you invest the money there. But that is used as almost like a way of seeding private investment. So there's a bit that isn't quite viable at the moment, or needs patient equity in, or even grant. So those kind of things I think are a neat way, and we've done one before and it's been quite successful. So why wouldn't we do one again that's similar but for a different era?
And I'm thinking even in terms of Northern Ireland post Brexit. People talk to the opportunities of that. Are they being realised? Were there opportunities? Is there interest because of that? And how are we, almost working with those to harness that?
Funnily enough, I came from a meeting this morning where there is, if you take residential in Belfast, for example, or private residential, that there is what they say a wall of cash waiting to invest in it, but the thing just doesn't stack up it doesn't even stack up in Belfast. So the question there is what element of public intervention, and I'm not talking about grants, but maybe a patient way of getting investment in, might solve that. Even with the McGee campus, there's elements of student accommodation in there which don't need to be funded by the public sector. If there's viable tenancies and rent flowing, they could be privately funded. No reason why not.
And really last point, HMOs. We don't have a culture of it here in Northern Ireland.
From South Belfast.
I had a constituent, who they can get it through planning, but it's even the planning departments in the various councils can't overly get their head around it. But it's something that we need to do strategically, because it's required for professional people who work in our hospitals, who are working in skilled environments, and they've nowhere to live. So if you were looking for an investment opportunity, HMOs might be. And it would help our housing problem too.
Key worker accommodation.
But it's not something that typically happens here, other than South Belfast. So
maybe you've needed. I have a couple of questions to come in on, but I'm conscious, Brian, you've asked to come back in. Go ahead.
Just maybe come back in on Ebrington. With Joan. I've enjoyed the visit today. I have to say, I'm sure all the committee members have. I found it very interesting. I had been at the site previously, but it wasn't as well developed, so it's good to see the occupancy that you have. So I don't know if you want to tell us a bit more, but going back to what Sinead was asking earlier about the intention of transferring to the council, I imagine you are wanting the entire site to be an asset. not a liability.
Yes.
And you want to say to the council, we're giving you something which is self-financing, potentially even money-making, but it's not, obviously it's not just valued in terms of finance, it's also in terms of what it does for the city, the opportunities it provides for tourists and local people. So in terms of the financial model, what progress would you say has been made to make the entire site wash its own face financially?
Well, before we even considered the conversations with the council and in terms of passing over, we wanted to ensure full occupancy. So we are at the stage now where every building on the site has a lease, an agreement for a lease, or works going on to move in. So in terms of that, we're in a good position that we would then work out which is what we're doing at the minute, the due diligence with our own finance colleagues to determine how much we spend, how much the maintenance is, and how much we take in service charges and potential revenue from other events, and then work with the council to determine, is that enough and does it wash its own face? I don't know if it would get to the stage where the outgoings and incomings match, so we might need to do a wee bit of work there with colleagues in the council to determine expectations, but that work has started. One of the accountants from finance has been working with us in the executive, or she's from the executive office but in the Ebrington team, and she's looking at the figures and doing a deep dive into those figures at the minute, so that's ongoing, and there is a meeting scheduled in the Derry for the PermSec and the Chief Executive, John Kelpie, of the Council in the near future to get those conversations ongoing.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Two final things. I'm conscious you haven't spoken, Johnny. Do you want to, you've come with us all this way, is there anything you think that the committee should hear or you'd like to share with them?
Nothing in particular. I mean, I think Scott has
okay.
a good job
That's okay.
in covering everything. I think probably the only thing would just be to emphasise that the investment strategy does remain in draft and under consideration by ministers, so I suppose some of the figures and things we've talked about today might change between now and when the final version comes before the Assembly, so I think probably just important to note that.
That's fair enough, thank you. And just a final question for me there, it's on your enabling action plan number 11 there, you've said prioritise legislative and regulatory changes. Obviously we had a period in this mandate where we weren't legislating as such, and have you got a list of what legislative and regulatory changes you want to see, and are some of them already in this executive legislative programme for this year, or they're coming in the next one? Is there anything we can do to support you in terms of pushing for those to come forward, whether it's through our own committee or economy or infrastructure or anything?
So that the primary focus of that action is the 80% renewables on the system by 2030 and the enormous amount of legislation and regulation that's required to achieve that.
Okay.
DFE are leading on that, and they are their thoughts are to bring a cross-departmental project together for that, similar to the way it's been done in Dublin. Same themes around route to market, regulation and planning. Things that need to change quickly to get to that point by 2030.
So there aren't necessarily identified bills as such ready to come before the Assembly, for example, for scrutiny?
But I think there'll be things like policy changes for planning.
Yes.
Which Claire brought up earlier. I don't know what they are, but there will probably have to be. And there'll be, there could well be regulatory changes as well required.
Okay. That's okay. No,
regulator.
I'm just conscious of the fact that we don't have a lot of money, but if there were legislative changes that could unpick and stuff, and if there's anything we can do as an executive office committee to actually try to perpetuate any of that, we would be happy to write and plan.
That's such an important action, that.
Yes.
Because, if we're going to get sustainable goals in the future, they need to plug into something.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Yeah. Anybody else? Any final questions or no? Okay. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. It's a very exciting project to be getting on with, and we look forward to seeing the strategy in its final form coming before us.
Thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Okay, members, just moving on with the agenda then. So just an update on the inquiry into gaps in equality legislation. So the committee staff have been working with the engagement team at Parliament Building. So the event on the Wednesday the 4th of December in the morning, I think that's starting to take shape. I think he's have a list of people who are being invited, but it's just if there's any other groups that you think that, well, you know, across all the different sections, disability, ageing, women's, etc. If there's any groups that you feel are could really contribute to the conversation around gaps in equality legislation, if you could send them through. Okay, so just moving on from that, then the forward work programme. Then, so you'll find it on page 26 of your pack. And it's just to advise you that the session of next week's committee meeting will take place with Forest na Gaeilge and Ulster Scots Agency, and Forest na Gaeilge have requested that their evidence be taken in Irish. Therefore, we're moving into room 29 rather than 30, and so that will allow them for simultaneous translation, because it's only available in that room. But that means that any members who are joining remotely then won't
work. No.
Won't work. No. So, if you can be there in person,
unless you're fluent in Irish.
Yes. Okay. So, go ahead.
Well, just before you move on from forward work programme, if you finish on that point. Just further to what I asked earlier about the legal advice.
Yes, okay.
And I just want to reiterate the urgency that I think we do need to act on this matter. I think there has been an erosion of public confidence in safeguarding oversight, and I'm mindful that the week after next is recess, and we would lose another week. So, given that I think the deadline for the legal advice was before next week, would be the 22nd, I think you said. So, can we aim to have First Minister Michelle O'Neill and Junior Minister Riley, and if necessary the other two ministers, at our meeting next week? Can we aim for that to happen?
I think,
because I'm just concerned, as I say, with the length of time, and there's been other revelations this week.
Okay.
And I do think the public is expecting us to seek clarification on matters, and to do so in the shortest possible timescale.
Okay, well, I think there's two. I'll bring the clerk in a second. I think there's 2 points. First of all, the legal advice was to see on what basis we could bring either the First Minister and Junior Minister or all four back. So it wasn't necessarily about whether we could compel at this stage. It was really just to see the basis on which. So I think that until we get that legal advice, we can't move forward with a request to the private office. Am I right?
Yes, that's correct. What committee members could do is formulate a list of questions they'd like to ask the First Minister, and then that will give legal a better idea of the precise things that we want to ask, because there's a very specific rationale for inviting them.
I sort of tried to. Yeah, sorry.
It has to be to do with their statutory functions. It can't be other peripheral things. Initially, once they're in committee, of course, members can ask what they like.
I did try to tease that out at the start last week. I did say, look, can you give specifics around the reasons why? So I think there were some given. But the second point was, and I'm not sure whether you were in the chamber at the end of plenary yesterday, when your colleague Jonathan Buckley stood up and made a point of order to see if the Speaker could ask the First Minister to come before to answer some of the questions. Obviously, yesterday afternoon there was. There was the other issue of the texting. So that's almost a simultaneous process, which might allow then the wider Assembly to comment on that. But the legal advice is progressing. It would be useful if we could.
Yeah, it usually takes 10 days for urgent matters, 20 days for semi-urgent matters. Mm-hmm. So I've asked them to do it as quickly as possible, but with legal advice, they much prefer to get it absolutely right rather than get it through quickly.
Mm-hmm. But, yes, if the First Minister comes to the Assembly, that will provide an opportunity, but we're limited then to one question, as I commented at our last meeting.
Yes.
And there's not the same opportunity to properly scrutinise, and get clarification on matters. Can we not put in the request if the ministers would be willing to come? You're talking about compelling them to come and so on. Well, can we not put in the request if they're willing to come?
Well, there's two parts to that. I think the committee agreed last week that this would be the first step, would be the legal advice. So if we're going to maybe take a different decision today, do you want to comment on that?
No, that's absolutely right, Chair.
Okay.
Yes.
But I do, whenever I received, and I said this last week, but I'll repeat it today, whenever you emailed me, I then spoke to the clerk and said, could you let the Dallo and the private office know that this is, as a committee, is something that we. So I think they're expecting the invitation anyway, aren't they?
Yes, they are. Yes, they're
Well,
they're ready for it.
I would propose that we put the request in for next
As a
Wednesday, and as a request, because we are going to then lose a further week with recess, and I just think we have a duty, a public duty, to be seeking answers, in the interest of public confidence.
Okay. So are people in agreement, or would you just like me to put that to a vote? Or, sorry, other people want to comment before we move on, actually?
If the legal advice were to come back and we do have a legal basis on which to invite them back, what is the process for compelling them rather than asking them? Is that another legal process we have to seek advice on, or is there already a standard process for that?
Well, we're in the compelling process for the institutions, and as you know, that takes some time.
Right. Okay.
I would hope. I would hope there would be an expectation that if there is a legal basis anyway for calling them, they would come anyway, simply because it's the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, but that didn't happen with the junior ministers.
Well, so what, for example, with the religious orders, so we set the date, we're given 4 weeks to reply, and then we will then move into the compelling, so it would be more like an 8 week.
Is it different, though, because it's the Executive Office, which we have a direct scrutiny responsibility for? Is that process, it wouldn't be the same for an external?
No. I'd have to seek advice on that.
Okay.
Exactly what that looks like. The working assumption is that ministers will come.
Okay.
Brian, were you suggesting through the chair that it was just an invitation and not a compel? Is that what you were just?
Well, I'm just mindful of the timeline on this, and I think originally I had requested if it could be for next week, and the legal advice isn't available today. We will have it by next week, but then there's a recess. I'm suggesting, I mean, obviously the ministers are aware of this request, and if it's down to whether we have the right to compel them or not, I would still prefer that we put in the request for them to attend next week, and if we have to utilise our statutory powers, to compel ministers to attend, then that's a backup option.
Can I just come
Go
in?
ahead.
Just for the clerk, are you aware of any instances where ministers actually had to be compelled to come to committee? That would be quite unusual.
No,
I know.
my understanding is that there have been occasions where ministers have been reluctant to come, but eventually they would have come to the committee. It would be helpful if members had specific questions that we could put to the private office as to the reasons, as to the questions that we want to ask. Now, once the questioning starts, obviously there might be development in that discussion, but if members could supply specific questions, I'd like to ask the First Minister and Junior Minister Riley.
Could I come in again then,
Yes,
if you don't mind? I just wanted to be clear on the proposal on the table here, because I know there was a bit of discussion last week whether you just wanted to invite one minister and one junior minister, or whether you want to invite all ministers, because I would be worried that if we put the request in for just one minister, they would just come back and say no, it's a joint office.
And that was why we were
And
trying to get the legal
that was kind of what the legal advice was on. But I do just think if you just put a request, my personal opinion would be that if you put in a request for just one minister, the automatic response would be no, because one minister doesn't just come to committee, so that delays it anyway.
Yeah.
So just to be clear what the proposal on the table is for the invite.
It's one office.
Yeah.
Carol
No,
said last.
well, I think in terms of being a request, then let it be for the 4 ministers.
Yeah.
If that enables things to move more timely.
I think not, but I think the office can then decide. Do they just want to set? They can decide themselves.
Okay, go ahead, please.
No, I was just, it sort of speaks to the fact that what you want to ask about is nothing to do with the ministry. So you can invite all ministers and you're not going to ask two of them any questions. So it sort of defeats the purpose of getting legal advice in the first instance if we're then in advance of that legal advice going to go ahead and do what you wanted to do last week anyway. So we're sort of going around in circles here a wee bit.
Yeah, I'm not clear that what the legal advice enables or prevents. If we can put in a request and if we can have questions submitted in advance, if that helps things to move on.
Okay, so I'm wondering then, Sinead, do you have anything to say for it?
I'm just sitting listening to what everybody is saying. I do believe that in the interest of us all doing our work effectively, we need to get the situation resolved. And it would be, I believe, in the interests of the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister to present themselves in front of the committee and for us to ask questions in and around child safety, safeguarding, unresolved questions that maybe attempts were made to answer, and now subsequently they have developed even further, and there's more questions for us to ask. I think bringing the Minister in front of the Assembly is, as Brian said, not the most effective way to get to the bottom of some of these issues, because it's one question, no supplementary, and if it isn't answered, well, it isn't answered, and a half an hour later it's all over. And so the situation wasn't resolved at that point of question, and I think the Executive Office, the committee here, would be much more effective in resolving some of these issues and allowing us to get back to the work of the committee. And I do believe that it is important for this committee to understand the outworkings of what has gone on within Sinn Féin. It's important because, with absolutely total respect, we in this committee look at other organisations and compel them on their role and their duty on child safety and child abuse, etc., etc. And yet the person who is leading this, the Executive Office, has questions to answer. So it is absolutely, totally, it's totally within the remit of this committee.
Michelle came to this committee, and she came to the chamber, and she answered in total, an hour's worth of questions. So what questions are now being asked that are relevant to the work of this committee? Get the legal advice. Because you know what it's
well, I'd hoped that we would have had the legal advice back by today, so I take the point of Brian from earlier on the meeting. So, two things. If we can send an email out today, Tom, if that's okay, and give people a deadline by maybe close of business on Friday, so that gives us then, obviously, with 2 working days, then to send through specific questions that you would be, well, they don't have to be that developed, but the sort of lines of questioning that you would like to raise when they come back. The second part is that I'm very conscious that the last time we had 2 really important panels coming up afterwards, so we had to condense it. So I think that we would I'd probably try to speak to the clerk around how we would rejig this. But for example, if the First Minister came back and said, I can't come on Wednesday, whatever date, would there be, and writing this to the clerk, would there be the potential for us to have a second meeting that week, for example, if the First Minister is only available at 10 o'clock on the Tuesday morning or something? Can we convene, as opposed to an informal committee meeting, can we convene a formal committee meeting outside our usual?
Yes, if members are available and willing, we can arrange a committee meeting at any time.
Okay.
On any day.
Okay.
Because I'm just conscious that we're recess, and then we've got the 2 language bodies next week, which obviously is very central to the work of this committee and the department. So,
I was just going to say, I'm mindful that, not to preempt the legal advice, but if this is scrutiny of the Executive Office, that is a joint office.
Yes.
So it's not necessarily if it's just the First Minister available.
No, well, I'm just saying, but I think we might have to be flexible around if we're going to come back as a committee to do that scrutiny piece, then we will have to be.
No, I appreciate it, but as long as the Deputy First Minister, if she's not available, is agreeing, or by assumption, that whatever the First Minister says represents her office, because it's a joint office.
Do you want to say something, Emma?
No, because it's obvious what's going on here, and it's not relevant to Emma Little Pengelly isn't going to be able to answer questions because it's nothing to do with her. So,
well, from my perspective, it's the integrity of the office, which
well,
is a joint office, and you know it is the, you know, if one's not happy, then they have the opportunity to resign, as we've seen in the past.
But that hasn't happened.
It hasn't happened, but it's the integrity of the office, and safeguarding very much is the remit of this committee and that department. So, and there are First Ministers. So.
Yeah, and she's already answered a load of questions around this.
But
and this has been,
it's
been talked about at length, and it's very obvious what's happening here. And that's, by all means, I'm just saying, we're going into now maybe circus territory a wee bit.
in terms of...
I think you tell that to the general public.
Well,
Okay.
I talk to the general public every day.
And what sort of...
Okay, guys.
It's not the right term to use at all.
Right, sorry. Okay, I'm going to get a resolution here. Are we going to support Brian's proposal that we would write to the private office, and invite them all, and provide by close of business on Friday some potential questions or line of questioning to explain why we feel that there's an urgency that the First Minister and or all four, etc., come before us?
Next Wednesday.
Next Wednesday.
Possible.
Next Wednesday, possible, or some other time.
At the earliest available date. Yeah.
Yes. So is everybody in agreement with that, or would you just like me to put that to the vote?
No, anyway.
Is that okay?
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you. Any other matters arising in relation to the draft forward work programme? No? Okay, so correspondence, there's summary of committee correspondence, page 36. Anybody want to raise any correspondence or any items? No. Any other? Go ahead.
So it's the Commissioner for Ageing and Older People.
Yes, sorry, okay, yeah.
I'm conscious that he's coming, well, he is at the end of his term and it was extended. Is there something as a committee that we want to do to recognise that, or his reflect on his time in office and what hasn't happened and what should happen?
I forget his name, was it?
Eddie Lynch.
Forgot there.
That's actually a really good point. What date is he? End of the year?
That's difficult. I know the recruitment process has happened, so it could be imminent.
Okay.
Maybe you would want it later. Maybe he's just tired.
I suppose it was a very scathing letter there, and that he has sent in relation to his observations, and particularly around the draft programme for government,
yes.
And the lack of really inclusion, and obviously it was a well thought out letter when he sent it around to us and to the ministers, etc.
I'm wondering then, I'm just looking at the forward work programme, so we are getting a departmental briefing on the programme for government on the 6th of October. I'm conscious that I don't want to start piling our agenda again, but that might be an opportunity for him to come then, give, as you say, the reflections, but also then to speak to his submission on the programme for government.
Yeah.
Is that potential? Okay, thank you.
Chair.
Yeah, go ahead.
Apologies, I'm probably going back to forward work programme. I don't know if they've contacted everyone. The Truth Recovery panel did contact me, and Barry and I had a brief online meeting with them. Two particular issues they raised that was relevant to what the presentation we had last week with Prony. I think it was last week or the week before.
Yeah, it was.
About the transfer of records. So they were concerned that some of the records had not transferred, and they were also concerned about a lack of budget that they had to publicise the work. So I don't know if they've reached out to others on those matters. I'm just wondering whether we could have them back sooner. To explain their particular concerns. They do feel this is impacting on their research and the work. They have, I think they said up to around 100 testimonies now that they have received. But they are concerned that some of the records have not been forthcoming through FCAS and so on.
Okay, so I'll leave that to the clerk and his team to see if they can slot it in. I'm looking at like the 4th of December. I know it's not that imminent, but in terms of a natural panel to go with, but they have noted it, and we'll see.
I think there's some particular matters, and I think they're concerned about the time scale here.
Yes. Okay, yeah, and then even the following week might be an opportunity. Okay, anything else? No? Okay, any other business, anyone? No? Okay, thank you so much. And thanks to those of you who've travelled up from Belfast all the way, and probably even further afield. So next week, as I say, we're back down in Parliament Buildings, but it is in room 29. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, for all the effort.
Thank you, Harry. Thank you.